Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, a couple days ago, I covered the Vox video on the history of the Israel and Palestine situation. And that video got a real good response, got a lot of opinions, as you can imagine. So I thought we'd look at another one. And I said that Vox video was the #1 in views for Israel-Palestine history. And this one is #2. And it comes from the very famous channel Crash Course. So we'll check out what John Green and his crew have to say about this. I'm going to jump in if there's needed context, and hopefully here we can get another perspective of this, because that's so important in understanding these events. Our original video is down below. Let's get started. All right, here we go.
This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, hopefully without a flame war.
This video is not new. But the crazy thing is you could say that anytime you make this video and have the same thing happen.
We're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, hopefully without a flame war. Big ask, Mr. Green. I mean, that fight goes back thousands and thousands of years. Except thousands of years ago, there wasn't an Islam yet, so no. Also, let me submit that very little of this conflict between Israel and Palestine over the last several decades has been about, theological differences between Islam and Judaism. No one's arguing about whether the most important prophets descended from Abraham's son Isaac or his son Ishmael, right? It's not about whether to fast during Yom Kippur or Ramadan. It's about land. Portraying the conflict as eternal or as religious makes it feel intractable in a way that, frankly, it isn't. So instead, let's begin, as most historians do, in the late 19th century. And instead of talking about religion, let's follow the lead of historians like James Gelvin and discuss competing nationalisms.
Okay. Yeah, obviously, yes, there is deep history. When you go to ancient ancient events going back to ancient Israel, early Islam, and all stuff. Yes, those exist, right? Those conflicts, theological differences. Yes. But kind of like the other video I watched too, and just kind of when you look at things, the conflict now is more in response to early events that people now have dealt with firsthand, rather than things their ancestors dealt with. Okay. So it looks like he's taken a similar approach to that, focusing on, again, the current things, which are much more seem to be in response to the actions happening.
Okay, so in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled over what we now know as Palestine. The population there, according to Ottoman records from 1878, was 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, and 3% Jewish.
Notice how small the Jewish population was in the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire fell with the end of World War I, 3% of a Jewish population. Very, very, very small.
Everybody spoke Arabic as the daily language, and in Jerusalem, the religious populations were roughly equal. To give you a sense of life in Ottoman Palestine, an Arab Orthodox Christian musician named Wasif Jaharia grew up in Jerusalem in the first decade of the 20th century, learning the Quran in school and celebrating both Passover and Eid with his Jewish and Muslim neighbors. Ottoman Palestine was, in short, a place in which people of different religious faiths lived peacefully together.
I mean, that had been Ottoman policy. Ottoman policy going back did have the jizya tax, especially early on, which was a tax on non-Muslims, so specifically affecting Christians and Jews. It's kind of part of their civil service policy, because all Muslims had to, in the Ottoman Empire, had to give military service, and they didn't require that from the Christian and Jewish communities. Therefore, they paid a tax to be able to maintain their religious belief and to avoid the military service. So, but then as far as culturally, yes, those different religions were all allowed to practice and protected the practice of those religions there. All through, again, Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years.
All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The late 19th century was the golden age of nationalism in Europe, and no place was crazier than the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which at least 10 different nations all wanted their own state. And in that hyper-nationalistic empire lived a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, who had hoped that Jews could assimilate into European nations, but soon became convinced that the Jewish people needed to leave Europe and settle in their own state. The concept of Jewish nationalism came to be known as Zionism.
Yep. So this is when that really started to get talked about. All right. A lot of people might think it had gone further back. You got to understand the history of the Jewish people in the region for the last 2 millennia. Remember, booted out by the Babylonians, brought in by the Persians, booted out, remember, by the Romans, booted after the Jewish revolt in the 1st century. So Jews have not had this unified homeland there since really like the BC era, you know, and But they still have maintained a community there, though, through all of this, though.
It's important to keep in mind that most Zionists
just not as a unified autonomous state. That doesn't exist.
Were secular Jews, so they imagined Israel as a state for Jews more than a Jewish state. In 1917, the British government, hoping to gain the support of Jewish people, issued the Balfour Declaration, promising, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. A bold promise, considering that Palestine was still technically Ottoman, as they hadn't yet lost World War I.
So the Balfour Declaration was my senior thesis in college. And they didn't mention that in the Vox video. It's super important. It really is, in a lot of ways, the first practical domino towards the creation of a state in Israel. Yeah, Herzl and Zionists claiming it and stuff like that, but now you have a power, an imperial power, the British, right, taking that goal, again, that Zionists had in the 20 years or so before this, and paving a way for that to be a reality. Balfour Declaration, again, basically meant that once this war is basically over, the British were supportive of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, with it being understood that it did not disrupt the local Palestinian population at that time. It did not create Israel, but again, understand that after World War I, Palestine's going to be under the mandate or rule of the British, and they can, have that happen. So it's kind of, it opened the gates for that Jewish population to start move in. The big question is going to be what is that actually going to look like in reality versus what it was supposed to look like on paper? That's what we'll see how they handle this.
Of course, they would soon, but it turned out that the British were over-promisers when it came to Palestine, because a year before the Balfour Declaration, the British had secretly promised the French that they would divide up the Arab territories and the Brits would keep Palestine. Furthermore, in 1915, other British officials had promised the ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, that he would rule over an Arab state, including Palestine, if he led an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, which Hussein promptly did. So basically, the Brits had promised Palestine to the Meccans, to themselves, and to the Zionists. What could go wrong?
Remember, all of these were things that the British were using to try to get its support to win World War I. War was on the mind. This was World War I. They're trying to get help in the Ottoman Empire. Fighting the Ottoman Empire is very difficult. The British were doing terrible at it. They failed horribly with their attack at Gallipoli to try to open up the Black Sea Passage, and did bad at it. So they wanted help from the inside, especially from the Arab world. That's your Lawrence of Arabia story. But yeah, hooking up with the Arabs in and around Mecca, and were very helpful. They would raid Ottoman trains and stuff like that. And again, with the understanding that support would lead them to get an Arab state, right, after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Did not happen. Was not given to them. Big mistrust there from the Arab world right away.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. So shortly after the end of the war, the British established a colony in Palestine with the idea that they'd rule until the Palestinians were ready to govern themselves. At which point the people living in Palestine were like, well, now seems good. And the British were like, yeah, but maybe not just yet. Meanwhile,
Churchill up on the right. Yeah, when you say stuff like that, like we're going to rule until you're ready, like it's not like defining, because what's going to determine what's the criteria, right? You can use that to always say, oh, they're ready now or they're not ready. That's hard to run a foreign policy like that, especially if you're the people waiting for the thing to happen. You know what I mean? So yeah, they're like, now please.
The British established separate institutions for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, making it difficult for Palestinian Christians and Muslims to cooperate, and easier for the British to, quote, divide and rule the inhabitants of Palestine. Again, what could go wrong? Meanwhile, the British...
Let's just appreciate how cool. I love the styles back then. They've got dude with the pointy hat, and then they got like the Catholic dude with the pointy hat. Good looking stuff there. Love that. Anyway, by the way, the most forgotten group in this Palestinian history of this last 100 years is actually Palestinian Christians, who have largely been lumped in with the Palestinian Muslims, because it's usually just seen as like Israel or Arabs. But then you forget that, yeah, there's also a lot of Christian Palestinians. And actually, a lot of them end up going into those areas today, like Gaza or West Bank and stuff like that. So the religious lines started to erase, and it became more about like ethnic groups.
and rule the inhabitants of Palestine. Again, what could go wrong? Meanwhile, the British did attempt to honor the Balfour Declaration's promise to, quote, facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions. Between 1920 and 1939, the Jewish population of Palestine increased by over 320,000 people. In fact, by 1938, Jews were just under 30% of the population of Palestine.
And remember, it was 3% under the Ottoman Empire. Went from 3 to 30 because of the Balfour Declaration.
The growing Jewish population focused on purchasing land from absentee non-Palestinian Arab landowners and then evicting Palestinian farmers who were living and working there. By controlling both the land and the labor, they hoped to establish a more secure community within Palestine. But of course, these practices heightened tensions between Jewish people and Arab Palestinians during the 1920s and 1930s.
And that's often been the justification for the land that was once Palestinian owned, and then with new Israelis or whatever coming in, was that, you know, they're supposed to come into land that was not basically claimed or being legally used. So one of the justifications that was used was for pre-existing land was, hey, some of these Palestinian farmers may be in default on their loans or can't make up, on their farm or their homes. And some of these, you know, Zionists would come in and then take over those deals, right? They would come in and say, well, we can pay for it. Some of them had a lot of money coming in, right? Moving in. And that displaced a lot of the Palestinians there. You're going to have to go deeper, and I would have to go deeper too into some of the legitimacies of those deeds being transferred. Were they legitimate, you know, transfers over from a Palestinian to an Israeli settler? Who's facilitating this when it comes to the banks? There's more to learn into that too, to see if there is anything corrupt going on or something like that. Maybe we can find out some more information as well. But I have heard of that as well, though, that some of that was corruptly done with the transfer of those deeds. But then also some of them I've heard were legitimate and just based on economics. So complicated there too, I think.
Along the way, Palestinian Arabs began to think of themselves as the Palestinian nation, and that growing sense of nationalism erupted in 1936 when the Palestinians revolted against the British. With the help of Jewish militias, the British brutally suppressed the Palestinian revolt, but in the aftermath, the British issued a white paper limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine and calling for the establishment of a joint Arab and Jewish state in Palestine within 10 years.
So there you can see one of the, I guess you'd call it compromises, was the Arab world did not obviously like this. They didn't like the Balfour Declaration. They didn't like that necessarily there was this big influence of immigrants coming in, but specifically that these people were coming in and also displacing Palestinians. So you can see they revolted against it, right? And then the compromise actually coming back, we saw with the British was, all right, we're going to limit that migration. But I think what we're going to see here, if he hits it, limiting that migration was also unsuccessful.
This managed to leave no one happy. The Zionists were angry at Britain for limiting Jewish immigration at a time when Jews particularly needed to leave Europe, and the Arab Palestinians were unhappy about the prospect of waiting 10 years for a state. And then came World War II, which was actually quite a peaceful time in Palestine.
And I'm not trying to say that it was good that there was this there's always this middleman in the middle of this, but you had that with the Ottoman Empire and you had that with the British that was able to force basically negotiations on there as a middleman. Now you don't have that. Now you just have which group is going to be stronger and be able to exert their will and exert their strength. And historically, since that, it's definitely been Israel has been able to be the more powerful group there.
But then it ended and tensions resumed, and the British realized that colonies like Palestine were far more trouble than they were worth, so they handed the issue of Palestine over to the newly created United Nations. They were like, oh, hey there, United Nations, for your first problem. So in November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into separate Palestinian and Jewish states. The partition plan called for 2 states roughly equal in size, but the borders looked like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, you do not look at this map and think, yeah, that's going to work.
Well, what you got to look at, though, is there's a lot of land that is very difficult to maintain in this area. Those Palestinian areas are largely in more populated, a lot of them are in more populated places at that time, right? So you had Gaza City and stuff in that bottom, you know where Gaza is today. And then right over here, we got the West Bank, which is the big, thing there. But over right on the edge is going to be Jerusalem, which obviously is going to have a high population center in it. So again, the idea was that Jewish immigrants would come into these blue areas that in some cases might be less settled and develop that land, but what you are going to see too is though some people displacing places. Again, it could be by being more financially stable or whatever.
Like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, you do not look at this map and
that's
think,
not what the map looks
yeah,
like
that's
now.
going to work. Sure enough, it didn't. And
There's
soon after the plan was announced, the cleverly named 1948 Arab-Israeli War broke out with Israel on the one side and the Palestinians and many Arab states on the other. The Israelis won, and when an armistice was signed in 1949, Israel occupied a third more land than they would have had under the UN proposal. Meanwhile,
yeah, and it's never gone back to those UN borders. It's never gone back to that, right?
Jordan controlled and later annexed the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled their homes and became refugees in the surrounding Arab countries. And to Israelis, this war was the beginning of their nation. To the Palestinians, it was the Nabka, the catastrophe, as they became stateless. Over the next 18 years, nothing changed territorially, and then in 1967, Israel and several Arab states went to war again. It was called the 6 Days War because, get this, it lasted 6 days.
Understand by this time too, Israel is hyper supported by the powerful Western nations. They really saw, an ability to be able to have an ally in this region where Western powers were not having very much success and alliances in this area because years and years of colonialism, right? Countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia and stuff like that are becoming independent and have had a history of being colonized or exploited or don't have promises kept by Western nations and are trying to do things like control their own resources, nationalize their industries so that foreign investors can't just come in and take over that. So that left fewer and fewer allies, both economically and militarily, from Western nations, where the creation of a new Israel could definitely be a possibility for them. And now you see that still today of Western nations like the United States being full supporters of Israel now. And Palestinians being kind of misplaced with that because they don't necessarily have the resource and stuff that the West finds as useful as, say, like Saudi Arabia or Egypt. So there hasn't been a lot of investment or of the support of really anything going on in Palestine by the powerful economic Western countries.
Won and then gained control over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. So the 1947 proposal looked like this. By 1967, things looked like this. Then the UN passed Resolution 242. Man, they are good at naming resolutions, which outlined a basic framework for achieving peace, including Israel withdrawing from the territory acquired in the war, and all participants recognizing the rights of both a Palestinian and an Israeli state to exist. This, of course, did not happen. After the war, the broader Israeli-Arab conflict morphed into a more specific Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is a nice moment to note that not all Muslims are Arabs, not all Arabs are Palestinians, and not all Palestinians are Muslims. Like there's a significant Christian minority of Palestinians, for instance. Palestinian is a word used to describe the ethnic identity of those.
But again, are usually thrown in with the Muslim Palestinian areas, not Palestinian Jews. And that's going to become less and less because these people moving in, these Jews are coming in. Remember, there's only 3% population of actual like Palestinian Jews. These are Jews coming in from Europe, from the United States, right? They probably consider like white Westerners. You know what I mean?
Who have historically lived in Palestine. There were, for instance, lots of Christians in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, formed in 1964 and led by Yasser Arafat. The PLO oversaw guerrilla groups that attacked civilians, but also used nonviolent approaches to try to achieve a Palestinian state. And meanwhile, the Israeli government began to establish Jewish settlements in what had been Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip.
I mean, Israel's thing is going to be like, hey, Arab world, you've attacked us multiple times with the first UN resolution and then in the 60s and later. So it's kind of like this thing where like we're justified in keeping these lands because we've been the victim of attacks that way. But then it would come back and the Palestinians would be like, well, you attacked us, I guess, by displacing people, by moving them in and settling in places that were illegal settlements. So both feel justified pointing their fingers in this era at who is the aggressor.
There are now over 350,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and over 200,000 in East Jerusalem. And these settlements are illegal according to international law. But Israel counters by saying that they aren't really illegal because Palestine isn't really a state. By the late 1980s, Palestine...
I mean, there was supposed to be under the UN resolution, but that seems to have been completely forgotten and completely been unenforced. It was always unenforced, right? People coming to the West Bank, which again was supposed to be a Palestinian land, settlers, Israeli settlers coming in there and taking and coming into those lands was going on. The big thing, I guess when you come back to a lot of this, the UN plan was never enforced.
Palestinians launched the first intifada, which literally
and
means
it's hard to enforce it when you had a war right after.
Shaking off. And this began with like boycotts of Israeli products and services and refusing to pay Israeli taxes. But when the Israeli armed forces cracked down on protesters, violence ensued. And the first intifada also saw the founding of Hamas, which launched the first suicide bombing against Israel in 1993. Hamas gained support partly because of its militancy, but mostly because of its social welfare projects in Gaza. It built and staffed schools, mosques, and clinics.
Where a lot of the more secular organizations have either been in Palestinian regions, whether it's West Bank or Gaza, have often been delegitimized. The secular groups really have not had any bargaining power or any success negotiating anything with Israel. There's no real it's not as strong with military alliances. A lot of the Arab world especially after the 60s, was not giving them all that much support anymore that used to back in the past. Now you might get like a little bit of Iran or something, but not a lot is going in there. So people have kind of turned to Hamas as the only group now willing to do anything. And of course, what that's led to is these horrific attacks, because this Hamas group is pretty much the only group, it seems, left that will do things that they, you can argue they're counterproductive, but nevertheless have gained some support. Although a lot of Palestinians do not support Hamas. And never have, but because of the extreme tensions in that. But also they've seen that the secular, moderate attempts at trying to negotiate or anything have repeatedly failed.
Important legacy of the first intifada was the emergence of peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis. This led to the Oslo Accords and a peace process based on our old friend United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. But there were a lot of issues to resolve. I mean, putting aside the question of like how to make two states that don't look like a jigsaw puzzle, there was the question of the Jewish settlement and the right for Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to Palestine, water rights, which are a big deal in that part of the world, and so on. It's very complicated. So then came the Clinton talk. So it's time for the open letter. But first, let's see what's inside of the globe. Oh, look, it's a collection of philandering American presidents. An open letter to Bill Clinton. Hey, Bill, so your talks probably came closer than any other time in recent history to an actual peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was willing to give up more land currently claimed by Israel than at any time in the past. Even Yasser Arafat was surprised. Although not all the questions got addressed, you were definitely closing in on something. But in the end, it didn't happen, and since then, not to criticize you, things have gotten kind of worse and worse and worse. Worst of all, that was your big legacy moment. Now all you've got is the conflict in Northern Ireland getting resolved while you were president. In short, it could have been amazing, but instead it was kind of meh. Kind of like your presidency, actually. At least you'll always have those vodka-soaked hugs with Boris Yeltsin to look back on. Best wishes, John Green. So the Clinton talks failed, Ehud Barak's government was undermined, and then in September of 2000, Prime Minister candidate Ariel Sharon led a group of 1,000 armed guards to the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem.
Remember, they didn't state it here, but even in that UN resolution, Jerusalem was supposed to be a place that was not administered or owned, I guess you would say, by either group. It was supposed to be an international city. It's supposed to be one that, again, is too significant to try to decide if one person can operate it. And now what you're seeing, he's saying like putting troops on like the Temple Mount, which is the biggest, most important part of Jerusalem, right? Where you got the Wailing Wall and then you got the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the Golden Dome there. And now like trying to like establish authority over that is also something that people are going to dislike, no matter who is doing it.
To Muslims, this is known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's the third holiest site in Islam, behind only the Kaaba in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. And it's the holiest site in Judaism, so in short, it's a pretty touchy place to march to with 1,000 armed guards. Right. So the event sparked a massive protest, which eventually led to the much more violent second intifada, in which more than 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were eventually killed. In 2002, the Israelis, claiming to act in defense of civilians, began construction of a wall around the West Bank, but instead of following the borders established after the 1967 war, the barrier was built to include many Israeli settlements on the Israeli side.
So that going to be for multiple reasons that make the Palestinians upset. Is not only, they didn't put the borders that they didn't even like originally, but also put in borders to put in who the people that they felt were illegally moving in. And now you have, that happening there. And also that means once you do that, you also have control of what goes in and out of, say, the West Bank. And then same thing's going to happen in Gaza, where it's completely covered or completely has been completely surrounded with walls and border protection, where nothing can get in and out without really Israel being able to facilitate that. Which is very difficult because that means they control the natural resources, the food coming in. They're going to control energy, so like power, going to control water and stuff like that. They can completely control the borders in there. And when you do that, you can stranglehold, people like that if you're that successful at controlling borders.
To Israelis, that was about self-defense. To Palestinians, it was an illegal land grab. Then in 2005, Yasser Arafat
Palestinians,
died,
it feels like they're, to them, they, you might hear them refer to it now. They talk it like it's a prison now, like Gaza, especially Gaza, but maybe in the West Bank too, that it's more like a prison, an open air prison. You might hear that term bounced around.
Shortly thereafter, Hamas won a majority of the parliamentary seats. Since then, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have sort of divided how to govern Palestine, and it's also sort of been poorly governed. In the past 10 years, Hamas has frequently launched rocket attacks into Israel. Israel has responded with extended and extremely violent invasions of Palestinian territory that have seen thousands of Palestinians killed, many of them militants, but also many not.
The common story you see is, especially with Hamas, remember, you also have to like disassociate some things. Hamas does not represent all Palestinians, not even just Gazans. But nevertheless, they're still within those communities. Therefore, the communities, have to pay the price for that too, whether they support those actions or not. So if Hamas is, doing things like, again, like launching rockets into, whatever, especially rockets. That's the big thing, because they don't have a standing army to like move people in. So rockets into Israel, and if they make it through the Iron Dome, they're going to hit civilians, and they do a lot. And then just like clockwork, this happens every time one of those attacks happens. There's a retaliation that comes back towards Hamas that is usually tenfold when it comes to casualties, including civilians as well.
Parties claim to be responding to the provocations of the other, but much of the conflict reflects a consistent failure on all sides to understand the legitimacy of the other's narrative. To Palestine, the Palestinian people have been denied a state not just since the formation of Israel, but also for decades before that, and now they live under what amounts to a military occupation. And that's all true. To Israel, the Jewish people clearly need a homeland, which the United Nations established. And they certainly aren't the first nation-state to consolidate and increase their territory via military victory. And they need to protect their...
Especially because they feel that, hey, you attacked us, you lost the war, we get something in return, right? Like more land to expand your homeland into.
Nation against the many active threats made against them by their neighbors. That's also true. It's important to understand the internal logic of these competing nationalist visions. For both Zionist and Palestinian national visions to eventually work, it's necessary to understand the right of each to exist and the legitimacy of each's historical narrative. But these problems...
Looks like he's gonna put the stipulation, but the question is, how possible will that be, of being able to see each other's legitimate claims? Now, it really got glossed over there, but it's important to understand the effect World War II and the Holocaust had on the idea of a Jewish home state, like that, how horrible the Holocaust was. And again, that's a reason why there was also a lot of immigrants, actually Jewish immigrants, as you can expect, coming to, flee from World War II and the Holocaust, coming into Israel, gave the plight of the Jews so much more support for the creation of that, and was used as a justification of there needs to be a Jewish homeland, right? But then Palestinians are like, well, why here? Why should it displace us? That's their argument. So it's like both hold true to these arguments and have been.
Aren't thousands of years old, the legitimacy of each's historical narrative. But these problems aren't thousands of years old, and they aren't intractable. They emerged in the British Mandatory period. But let's hope that by understanding that this isn't an endless religious war, that we might be closer to seeing its end. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
All right.
Crash Course is filmed here in the chat and state.
Okay. All right. Final thoughts. All right. Even with a video made, a few years ago with this, it brings in, it's the same thing you're hearing now and then, which is like the two will have to, like, I guess he was right. They have to observe each other's legitimacy, but is that going to be possible? And he took it looked like a pretty cynical view of that, which a lot of people I think do now. As far as what's the solution here? A lot of people, originally and still support like this two-state idea, but there's people like, well, that's kind of what it's been. But the problem is when one of those states is not on even ground when it comes to military or economic power for foreign support, right? Then the two-state solution is going to be difficult. But then it's like, all right, single-state solution, and you just democratize the whole thing. Is that going to be possible with so much emotionally charged history happening in these years? Where can these people peacefully coexist? And then it goes back to the idea of when were they able to peacefully coexist? And again, remember, when they were peacefully coexisting, that was under British occupation, and then Ottoman population. And it wasn't a 50-50 split, as you saw there, specifically when you're talking about Muslims versus Jews, the Ottoman Empire, right? It was like 87% Muslim, right? And then, they're like 3% Jewish. So it was never balanced like much more like it is now. So it seems like there's so many now dividing things about two-state versus one state, or does it have to come to the horrible conclusion of one or the other is completely wiped out? And if that happens, what does that involve? Would the world stand by and allow that to happen? Knows, right? But let's keep digging into the historical context. We're obviously looking at some of these videos. We want to look at a lot of different things. The last two videos now I've watched, though, are from, like American outlets like Crash Course and Vox. So you also, you hope that they take in the accounts of both the sides kind of on the ground internally, but we have to keep trying to get many sources from and many different types of sources. And that's going to be important as these events keep going, is what sources are you looking at? Because there's so many out there, but there's also misinformation that happens repeatedly. And I heard a famous thing that if misinformation can go out unchecked for an hour, then it will be successful no matter what. So it becomes hard. And for us as the people that see this, see these horrible things happening on the outside from the safe confines of wherever you live, if you're not there, it becomes so important to understand context, understand history, and try to look at everything, I guess. So anyway, it's not going to be easy, though. It's not fun. Okay, there's no easy process for this. It takes work. So with that, maybe I can be a part of that and try to get sources out and stuff like that. But you got to make sure that you're analyzing things and making sure you're doing it in a safe and reliable way. We'll call it that. All right. With that, thanks for being here. We'll see you next time. Bye.